Grandfather had a saying he repeated every Sunday at the dinner table. He'd set down his fork, look around at whoever was there, and say, "A man who prepares for nothing deserves everything that comes to him." I used to think it was just old man talk, the kind of thing you nod at and forget by the time you're back in your car. I was 26 when I finally understood what he meant. And by then, it was almost too late. My grandfather passed on a Tuesday in late October. My grandmother had gone 3 years before him. A stroke, quick, the way she would have wanted. He followed her the slow way, which was harder to watch but somehow felt more like him. Stubborn until the end. He lasted 2 winters longer than the doctors predicted, and I think part of him did it just to prove a point. I was the one who was there. Not because I was the favorite. I don't think he had favorites. Not really. But because I was the one who showed up. Every other weekend for 4 years, I drove 40 minutes out to the house on Millbrook Road, helped him with the gutters, sat with him through the bad TV he pretended to like, made sure the prescriptions were filled. My father came maybe twice a year. My uncle showed up at Christmas with a bottle of wine and a handshake. My stepmother sent cards. I'm not saying this to make myself sound noble. I'm saying it because it matters to what happened next. The house on Millbrook Road was not a small thing. My grandfather had bought it in 1971 for what seemed like nothing then. And it had sat on 2.5 acres that nobody paid much attention to until the town started expanding and a developer put in a subdivision 3 streets over. By the time my grandfather passed, that house and that land were appraised at just under $1.2 million. There were also savings accounts, a CD ladder he'd been rolling over since the 90s, and a brokerage account my grandmother had set up and never touched. All told, the estate was closer to 1.6. I knew this because he told me. Not in a dramatic way, not with papers spread across the table. Just one afternoon in March, about 8 months before he died. He asked me to sit with him in the front room, and he said, "I want you to know what's here, and what's supposed to happen to it." We talked for 2 hours. He showed me the files in the cabinet by the window, the ones in the green folders. He told me about the attorney he'd used for 30 years. A man named, well, I'll just call him the attorney, because he ended up being more important than any other person in the story. My grandfather told me where the deed was, where the original will was, and he told me something else. He said, "Your father is going to want this house. He's been waiting for it." I didn't say anything. What was there to say? He looked at me for a long moment. "I've already handled it," he said, "but you need to make sure it stays handled." I didn't understand what he meant at the time. I nodded and we moved on, and I helped him with dinner and drove home in the dark. I thought about it on the way, turned it over a few times, then let it settle somewhere in the back of my mind where things go when you're not ready to deal with them. The attorney called me 2 days after the funeral. He was matter of fact, not unkind. He told me there was a will, that I was the primary beneficiary of the estate, and that my grandfather had also, 3 years ago, apparently, without telling anyone else, established a revocable living trust and transferred the majority of the assets into it, the house, the brokerage account, most of the savings. He had left smaller amounts to my father and uncle as specified cash bequests, $20,000 each, clearly outlined, clearly intentional. The rest came to me through the trust. The attorney said, he set this up specifically to avoid probate. The trust assets don't go through the court process, they transfer to you directly. I sat in my car in the parking lot outside my apartment for about 20 minutes after that call ended. I was not thinking about money. I was thinking about that Sunday afternoon, the green folders, the 2 hours in the front room. I was thinking about the saying, I should have called my father that week. I know that now. Maybe if I had called and explained it calmly, given him a chance to process it before he heard it from someone else, things would have unfolded differently. But I was 26. I was grieving in the quiet way that doesn't look like grief from the outside. And I told myself there was no hurry. There was a hurry. My father found out through the probate notice. The will was filed, and even though the trust assets bypassed probate, the will itself became public record. My father hired someone. I still don't know who, a paralegal or just a courthouse regular, to pull the filing and read through it. He called me on a Friday evening, about 3 weeks after the funeral, and the conversation lasted less than 4 minutes. He said the will was invalid. He said my grandfather had not been of sound mind. He said he was going to contest it. He said that the house, which had been in the family since before I was born, was not something I had any right to, and that he and my uncle were aligned on this. I said, "I hear you." He said some other things. I let him finish. Then I said I'd get back to him, and I hung up. That night, I looked up everything I could find about will contests and trust challenges. I read for 4 hours. What I learned was this: contesting a will is one thing, and contesting a properly funded trust is another thing entirely. The trust was not a will. It had been established years ago, when my grandfather was clearly competent, by an attorney who had known him for 3 decades. The transfer of assets into the trust had been done legally, with documentation, with a pour-over will that matched. There were no grounds I could see. But I also learned that no grounds I could see, and no grounds anyone will pursue, are not the same thing. Litigation is expensive, whether you're right or wrong. The goal of a challenge is sometimes not to win. Sometimes it's just to tie things up long enough that the other side runs out of money or patience and settles. I called the attorney on Monday morning. I told him what my father had said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your grandfather anticipated this. He left notes." He hadn't mentioned notes before. I drove out to his office that afternoon. It was a small office above a dry cleaner on the main street of a town I'd driven through 100 times without stopping. The attorney was older than I expected, gray and measured. The kind of man who looked like he'd heard every variety of family disagreement there was, and found none of it surprising anymore. He handed me an envelope. Inside was a 2-page letter in my grandfather's handwriting, dated 2 years before he died, notarized, and signed in front of 2 witnesses. It was not a will and not a legal document in any formal sense. It was a statement, a clear, coherent, detailed description of why he had made the choices he made, who had been present in his life, and who had not, and what his intentions were. He mentioned my father by name. He mentioned the years of distance, the Christmas bottles of wine, the absence. He mentioned me by name too. The weekends, the gutters, the prescriptions, the long afternoons. He had written it like a man who knew the letter would one day need to be read aloud in front of someone with a law degree. The attorney said, "This won't stop a challenge from being filed, but it will make one very difficult to sustain." I drove back to the house on Millbrook Road that evening and sat in the driveway for a while. The porch light was on. I had turned it on when I came by earlier in the week to check on things, and I'd forgotten to turn it off, and now it was on in the dark, like the house was expecting someone. I sat there and thought about my grandfather in that front room, telling me he had already handled it, that I just needed to make sure it stayed handled. He had been preparing that letter while I thought we were just talking. My father sent a formal letter to his own attorney about 6 weeks after the funeral. It outlined his intention to challenge the will on grounds of undue influence and questioned whether the trust had been established under duress. It was addressed to the estate attorney and copied to me. Reading it, I felt something that wasn't quite anger. It was more like a door closing. A quiet, final click. I met with the attorney again. He walked me through the options. We could respond formally, lay out the documentation, and hope my father backed down when he saw the strength of the position, or we could say nothing and let the challenge move forward, knowing the trust assets were largely insulated anyway. He recommended the first approach. I agreed. We sent a response package, the trust documents, the transfer records, the notarized letter, a timeline of the estate planning, and a letter from the attorney himself describing his professional relationship with my grandfather and the conditions under which the trust had been established. It was thorough. It was clean. It said everything without being hostile, which was harder to put together than being hostile would have been. My father did not respond for 3 weeks. In that time, I had one conversation with my uncle that I didn't expect. He called me on a weeknight, and his voice was different from my father's, quieter, less certain. He said he had seen the response documents. He said he thought what my grandfather had done was his right. He said he was stepping back from the challenge. I thanked him. He said, "He used to talk about you, you know, when we'd visit." He paused. I should have visited more. I didn't know what to do with that, so I just said, "I know." My father's attorney filed a formal objection with the probate court about a month later. It went exactly as my grandfather's attorney said it would. The trust assets were not subject to the probate proceeding. The will, which only governed the remaining non-trust assets, a car, some furniture, personal effects, was upheld without significant challenge because the notarized letter effectively preempted the undue influence argument. The cash bequests to my father and uncle were paid. Everything else came to me. The whole process took about 7 months. There were a few moments I'm not going to go into in detail. A conversation outside the courthouse, a voicemail from my stepmother that I still haven't fully processed, a weekend where I drove out to the house and just sat on the porch steps for 2 hours because I didn't know what else to do with myself. Grief and inheritance get tangled in ways that are hard to separate. You're mourning a person while simultaneously sorting through everything they left behind, and sometimes those two things feel like they're happening in completely different directions. The hardest part was not the legal process. The attorney had that under control, and my grandfather had laid the groundwork so carefully that there was very little I needed to do beyond show up and stay calm. The hardest part was the version of my father I kept expecting to appear and never did. The one who would call and say he'd read the letter and he understood and he was sorry. I kept making space for that conversation. It never happened. What happened instead was this. About 2 weeks after the probate court issued its ruling, I drove out to Millbrook Road on a Sunday morning. I had the keys. I had been going back and forth about what to do with the house. Whether to sell, whether to keep it, whether to rent it, whether there was some version of the future in which I moved out there and woke up every morning looking at the same yard my grandfather had looked at for 50 years. I hadn't decided. I walked around the outside first, the way he used to, checking the gutters and the foundation and the spots where the paint had started to peel near the back corner. I went inside and opened the windows because the house had been closed for months and it needed air. I made coffee in the kitchen where he had made coffee every morning of his adult life, using the same percolator that he had refused to replace with anything newer on the grounds that it worked fine. I took the coffee to the front porch and sat in the chair he always sat in, the one with the worn armrest on the left side, and I looked out at the road. A car slowed down in front of the house. I recognized it. My father's car. It idled for a moment at the edge of the driveway, and I sat very still, holding my coffee, looking out. Then it moved on. I don't know what he was expecting to see. I don't know what he was hoping for or what he thought was going to happen. Maybe he was just driving by. Maybe he wasn't, but he kept going, and I sat there, and the morning was quiet, and the coffee was the same as it had always been, strong and slightly bitter, exactly the way my grandfather made it. I thought about what it means to prepare, not in an anxious way, not in the way that assumes everything will go wrong, but in the quiet, deliberate way of a man who simply wanted the things he had built to go where he intended. He hadn't told me everything. He had told me enough. He had handled what he could handle and trusted me to hold what was left. The house is still mine. I rent it now to a young couple who keep the yard better than I do. And twice a year, I drive out and check the gutters. The brokerage account, I haven't touched. I want to think about that more carefully before I do anything with it. The percolator is in my kitchen. It still works fine. My father and I have not spoken since the week the ruling came through. My uncle sent a card at Christmas with a short note. I wrote back. I don't know what that becomes, but it's something. I think about my grandfather most when I'm doing the small maintenance things, changing the filters, checking the gutters, the kinds of tasks that nobody notices when they're done, and everybody notices when they're not. He spent his whole life doing the things that nobody noticed. He made sure the foundation was solid before anyone thought to ask whether it was. A man who prepares for nothing deserves everything that comes to him. I get it now. I finally get it. Before I go, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments, and if you've ever had to hold your ground when your own family came for what was yours, I see you. You're not alone in this. I've had a lot of time to think about what actually happened here, not the legal part. That part was handled carefully by a man who had been preparing for it longer than I'd known there was anything to prepare for. I mean the human part. The part where a family fractures over a house and a piece of land in 2.5 acres that nobody paid attention to until there was money attached to them. What I keep coming back to is this. My grandfather didn't win because he was lucky. He won because he thought ahead when it was still quiet. When there was no pressure, no urgency, no crisis bearing down on him. He sat in that front room and he made a plan. He found an attorney he trusted. He wrote a letter by hand and had it notarized. He built something that would hold, even after he was gone to hold it himself. That's not luck. That's the kind of discipline that most people only develop after they've already lost something they couldn't get back. I think about my father and what drove him to that driveway, idling at the edge of a property that was never going to be his. I don't think he's a bad man in some simple cartoon sense. I think he made 1,000 small choices over 20 years. To not show up, to not call, to send a card instead of himself. And those choices accumulated into a version of him that his own father didn't trust with the thing he'd spent his life building. The outcome wasn't a punishment handed down from somewhere. It was just the natural end of a long chain of cause and effect. He planted absence for decades and then was surprised to harvest it at the end. I planted something too, though I didn't frame it that way at the time. I just showed up. I changed the filters and filled the prescriptions, and sat through bad television and drove 40 minutes each way on weekends because that was what needed doing. I wasn't calculating. I wasn't positioning myself. I was just present, and presence turned out to matter more than I knew. The tricky thing about integrity is that it doesn't announce itself while you're living it. You don't drive home from a weekend visit thinking you're building trust or earning something. You're just tired and a little bored and glad you went. The meaning comes later, sometimes much later, sometimes only after the person who witnessed it is already gone. And what they saw in you is the only thing standing between you and people who wanted something different. My grandfather gave me a saying. He also gave me a model, a man who shows up, prepares quietly, documents what matters, and doesn't make noise about any of it until noise is absolutely necessary. I didn't understand that as a philosophy when I was learning it. I just thought it was how he was. It's how I want to be. If you've ever been the one who showed up, not for recognition, not for reward, just because it was right, and then had to defend what that meant when it finally counted. I hope this story landed somewhere useful for you, not as a blueprint, not as a legal guide, just as a reminder that the quiet work is never wasted. Someone is always watching, and sometimes that someone is the person who matters most, sitting in a chair with worn armrests, already writing the letter.